The independent members are for themselves, but this being for self is really no less immediately their reflection into the unity than this unity is the splitting up into independent shapes. The unity is divided within itself because it is an absolutely negative or infinite unity. And because it is what subsists, the difference too has independence only in it. This independence of the shape appears as something determinate for an other, for the shape is divided within itself, and the supersession of this dividedness accordingly takes place through an other. But this supersession is just as much within the shape itself, for it is just that flux that is the substance of the independent shapes. This substance, however, is infinite, and hence the shape in its very subsistence is a dividedness within itself, or the supersession of its being for self. Paragraph 170 is a transitional passage. It's a little bit hard to follow when you first go to it, in part because it's so jargon-rich and you're wondering, what do all these terms mean as we're moving from one to the other? I think it helps a little bit if we can spatialize it rather than just trying to read through the entire passage. But you might say this is one of those passages where the significance of it is really outside of itself. It's in what has preceded and where we're heading to. You notice the next paragraph after this is the quite long 171, where there's a lot of stuff going on. What happened in 168 and 169 and a little bit earlier was we've brought in this conception of self-consciousness as involving desire, and desire is, in this case for life, we've specified a little bit what life means, and we specified it in terms of the stuff that we see right here, these independent members, Gliedern being part of some sort of larger whole, a unity which is infinite, unendlich. It doesn't have a determinate limit. And we've talked about this being something like a substance, but a substance in terms of a universal fluid medium. And we've used that term before. Here the fluid medium is in fact life. Life, you might say, with a capital L, right? Life as a category of things. And we're trying to get to actual living things, but because we want to bring back somehow self-consciousness, which seemed to be outside of life, and the life that it is desiring, the life for which it has begeerde, it's being driven towards. So Hegel, let's actually look at the terminology very closely here. It says, the independent members, remember, the independent members of the unity, we talk all this stuff about axial rotation and time, there's a whole that these independent members are members of. Remember, they had to be independent so that there could, in fact, be an Aufhebung, a supersession, a transcending, a uniting of them into something. If they don't have any independent status by themselves, then they're just vanishing moments, as Hegel likes to say. So the independent members are for themselves. What does that mean? He says this being for self is really no less immediately their reflection into the unity. So they are for themselves, but they're for themselves not as sort of, a whole bunch of relations with each other, an immanent relation, but rather they're bound into something that exceeds them, that gives them their location, their meaning, this unity. And here Hegel talks in these terms that when we translate them, seem very, very big scale, absolutely negative, infinite. Well, infinity here, if we're thinking in terms of life, doesn't need to be the infinite, capital T, capital I. It just means something that does not have determinate limits that it remains within. If you think about what life actually consists in, it doesn't mean that at every moment, every single living thing is somehow beyond all limits, that it's the infinite per se, but rather that, whatever limits are placed, the living thing is already exceeding that. And so you can't draw a priori limits within which the living thing is going to say, except in an artificial way, right? You put something in a cage, now we've limited it. So he's going to talk about this unity. You notice I've drawn like this line down to here to the substance of shapes. Now, why did I do that? Well, this unity, he says, is divided within itself. So we're trying to represent division here, right? And, if it's an infinite unity, it's also going to be divided not just into two shapes. I know that when we've got this, bifurcation into self and other, it often gives an impression that what we're dealing with is just two things. But really, when we're talking about life, we're always talking about an entire plentitude or a spectrum or a whole bunch of things thrown in together. So we've got a whole bunch of, he uses three different terms that are important here: difference, division, and determination. So, we've got a division within the unity, because remember, every Hegelian unity is always, is a unity. It's not pure unity. It's always got a dividedness within itself. Also difference, that's important too. Unterschied. And then determination, Bestimmtheit, the case of being this thing rather than being a whole bunch of other things. As we're moving out from the unity to the independent shapes or Gestalten that it's breaking down into. Now, when we see Gestalten here, don't think Gestalt as in, oh, right, we've jumped to a new form of consciousness. The term has multiple meanings. In this case, it just means something, that is a unity, that is a whole in itself. So unity is broken down into a bunch of other unities. He says the independence of the shape appears as something determinate for an other, right? The shape, which is what? This unity is the splitting up into independent shapes. The unity is divided within itself. Why? Because of the kind of unity it is. Being absolutely negative, being infinite, means it's going to divide itself up. And because it is what subsists. It has the kind of being there for us, being, present, resisting, just, analysis or breakdown into other things, the way the independent members did, right? So independence here, relation, of course, between them, and then this breaks into these. So he says, the independence of the shape, and now we're just considering a single one of these many different independent shapes. The independence of the shape appears as something determinate, which means it is for an other. Determinacy means that it has to include alterity. It cannot just be determinate all by itself, disconnected from everything else. A lot of different ways this could take place. We're not trying to determine the exact form of determination here, right? Now, what does this mean, though? The independent shape is for an other, but what it does, Hegel says, is incorporate the other within it. And it also thereby supersedes the other and is also superseded or superseding itself through the other. So this is a very important point. He says the supersession is just as much within the shape itself, within the thing, for it is just that flux that is the substance of the independent shapes, right? So here we come down to this. The substance of the shapes is indeed this flux, this Flüssigkeit, this being able to move from thing to thing, which is what this unity is. So the unity of life is breaking down into independent shapes, or rather, giving forth independent shapes, all of which are determined by this. So this is an important structure. If we distinguish more exactly the moments contained here, we see that we have, as the first moment, the subsistence of the independent shapes, or the suppression of what diremption is in itself. That is, the shapes have no being in themselves, no enduring existence. The second moment, however, is the subjection of that existence to the infinity of the difference. In the first moment, there is the existent shape as being for itself, or being in its determinateness, infinite substance, it comes forward in antithesis to the universal substance, disowns this fluent continuity with it, and asserts that it is not dissolved in this universal element, but on the contrary, preserves itself by separating itself from this its inorganic nature, and by consuming it. Life in the universal fluid medium, as passive separating out of the shapes, becomes just by so doing a movement of those shapes, or becomes life as a process. The simple universal fluid medium is the in itself, and the difference of the shapes is the other. But this fluid medium itself becomes the other through this difference. For now it is for the difference which exists in and for itself, and consequently is the ceaseless movement by which this passive medium is consumed. Life as a living thing. This inversion, however, is for that reason, again, an invertedness in its own self. What is consumed is the essence, the individuality which maintains itself at the expense of the universal, and which gives itself the feeling of its unity with itself, just by so doing, supersedes its antithesis to the other by means of which it exists for itself. Its self-given unity with itself is just that fluidity of the differences or their general dissolution. But conversely, the supersession of individual existence is equally the production of it. For since the essence of the individual shape, universal life, and what exists for itself is in itself simple substance, when this substance places the other within itself, it supersedes this its simplicity or its essence. That is, it divides it. And this dividedness of the differenceless fluid medium is just what establishes individuality. Thus, the simple substance of life is the splitting up of itself into shapes, and at the same time, the dissolution of these existent differences. And the dissolution of the splitting up is just as much a splitting up and a forming of members. With this, the two sides of the whole movement, which before were distinguished, that is, the passive separateness of the shapes in the general medium of independence and the process of life, collapse into one another. The latter is just as much an imparting of shape as a supersession of it, and the other, the imparting of shape, is just as much a supersession as an articulation of shape. The fluid element is itself only the abstraction of essence, or it is actual only as shape, and its articulation of itself is again a splitting up of what is articulated into form, or a dissolution of it. It is the whole round of this activity that constitutes life, not what was expressed at the outset, the immediate continuity and compactness of its essence, nor the enduring form, the discrete moment existing for itself, nor the pure process of these, nor yet the simple taking together of these moments. Life consists rather in being the self-developing whole which dissolves its development and in this movement simply preserves itself. 171 is quite a long paragraph, and there's a lot going on there, so I'm going to pause about halfway through this and do some erasure, in part because what we're going to see about not quite halfway through the paragraph is this transition from the two moments that Hegel has picked out, a first moment and a second moment, that he characterizes a little bit at the beginning, but in ways that are probably rather confusing. He's going to talk about the second moment, but then he's going to shift to talking in terms of an inversion, a Verkehrung that's taking place. So let's focus just on figuring out what the first moment is. I don't think that it's going to be super helpful to look at the first few sentences. He says, if we distinguish more exactly the moments contained here, we have a first moment, we have a second moment. But then what he says about the first moment, doesn't seem to make that much sense. He said that we have these independent shapes and that they don't really have any enduring existence. They have no being in themselves. How do we get there? That's a strange thing to say after he's just insisted so much that they do have enduring existence. Well, what we're going to see developed in the rest of that first part of this paragraph is getting us ultimately towards life as a living thing. So we have a couple different senses of life being used here, distinguished here, you might say, being disentangled from each other. And it has to do with the what he calls the existent shape, or the Gestalt, right? We just saw that life itself is going to split up into a whole bunch of different Gestalten, independent shapes. How are these then related to life per se? They are living things, but what does that mean? Is life a sort of universal, the way that white is a universal for chalk and for other things as well? Or is life a different sort of category? Well, it's going to turn out to be that way, because life itself is involved in metaphysics for Hegel, right? So he says, in the first moment, there's the existent shape as being for itself, right? Being in its determinateness, infinite substance. So, okay, so that's good. We have an existing shape. We have something that has a depth to it. We've seen this developed before. We're beyond even force in the understanding, dealing with the inwardness of things, dealing with the inwardness of living things, organisms. Now, what does that do? He says what we'd expect is a reference to the universal substance, or as he's calling it, life in the universal fluid medium, life as such. We just went through this whole discussion about how life is this ever-changing and adapting and incorporating moment to moment to moment all of its portions or states or things like that into a whole. Now we want to think about the category of life per se, being living. What's the relation of the existent shape, the individual thing, the individual organism, to life in the universal fluid medium, to life as all living things have it? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. So what it means for Hegel to be a living being, an existent shape of life, is that you separate yourself out from the rest of life, from life as a universal. Even more interesting, he's going to call this the inorganic substance, the inorganic that is going to be consumed by the individual shape. He says it comes forward in antithesis to the universal substance. To be living is to stand out in a way different than other things that do stand out, that resist other things being there, do. It involves an activity of being in opposition, being opposed to the rest of life. So he says, it's not dissolved by this universal element. When it's dissolved by it, something else is consuming it, right? That'll happen eventually to every living thing, of course. Our bodies are going to break down and get eaten up by bacteria and molds and bugs and who knows what else. But so long as we are a living thing, we are standing out from, we are separating ourselves, we are in antithesis to the universal substance of life. And we, in pushing ourselves away from it, separating itself from its inorganic nature, he says, we consume it. Life in the thing consumes life, its medium. It takes advantage, you might say, of life to do something, to exert itself. You could say, well, it derives all of its energy or something like that from life per se. Sure. But once it's got a hold of it, it's going to, set itself aside and engage in a process of consuming. Why? Because it's being driven by desire. And desire, just at the level of life, is desire to consume. Desire to consume what is real, what has being, and to turn it into non-being, to make it part of oneself. There's an internal contradiction, you might say, to the process of desire's workings. So he says, here we go, life in the universal fluid medium, a passive separating out of the shapes becomes, just by so doing, a movement to those shapes. right? This process of separating, this process of consuming, is indeed life as process, which is different than life in the universal fluid medium. These are different sides of life. He goes on and he says, the simple universal fluid medium is the in itself. It's not, really doing anything. It's what is being explored, right? Being explored, though, by eating it up, by chasing it, by exerting oneself within it, by finding out what life really means, which is what organisms do in the course of their process. So it becomes the in itself, and the difference of the shapes is the other to that, right? So all of these different shapes over here is the other to that. But the fluid medium itself becomes the other through this difference. Why? Because the center of attention or the weight shifts to the individual thing. So he says, for now it is for the difference which exists in and for itself. A difference existing in and for itself is actually going to be, he says, the ceaseless movement by which this passive medium is consumed. What does that mean? We're talking about life as a living thing. We've become more concrete in our analysis now. We're no longer talking, this is still important, this general idea of life as, this booming, buzzing confusion, all the stuff out there. But now we want to focus in on the living thing. Now, as we turn to this inversion, which is the second moment that was being referenced at the beginning of this paragraph, what we find is that there's a whole bunch of things going on that are going to lead us to a culmination point, one that's quite important. Before we get there, it's worth dwelling a little bit on, or reminiscing, you might say, a little bit about what he's talking about here when he says that this inversion is indeed an invertedness into itself. Remember back to when we talked about the inverted world just in force and the understanding. This is where going through some of these previous shapes of consciousness and their dialectics can be quite helpful. The inverted world wasn't just everything topsy-turvy. Rather, inversion had to be a more complex process in which inversion involved invertedness within itself. I'm doing all these hand gestures. I hope that they can somehow convey, a little bit what's going on, just as much as the chalkboard can. It's very difficult to graphically represent these, but what it means is that inversion is not something so straightforward as just reversing polarity. Rather, there's this otherness being incorporated within the scope of what is being examined. So, he talks here about the inversion having to do with a consuming of the essence. And I've got, there's an awful lot on this board. Let me make very clear that what we're talking about here are two primary poles, right? The universal, or the universality, the essence, and the individual living thing. The individual living thing, as we've seen, places itself in antithesis to the universal, and it consumes it. What is it consuming? It's not just a universal like, thinghood or whiteness. It's life, livingness, you might say, or being alive. So these are the two important terms here. And we're going to see how these terms are connected. So he says, what is consumed is the essence, the individuality which maintains itself at the expense of the universal. This process of consuming is at the same time as being opposed to, being in antithesis, being a Gegenstand to, right? Being pushing off of. This whole thing is at the expense of the universal. So you might say the individual is able to draw upon the universal. Life, small l, is able to draw on the, not the capital, but let's say we'll call it the reserve, the endless, infinite reserve of life per se. And so what's going on after that? He says, by doing this, it gives itself the feeling of unity with itself. That's worth thinking about. So when we're involved in the activity of living, which is at the expense, whether we're consuming another life or not, is at the expense of life per se. You might say we're carving out our own piece of life. That gives us the feeling of being alive. That feeling of being alive is a feeling of unity with itself. Here would be a classic example. You're in shape, so, those of us who are out of shape, this doesn't really apply to us. For me, this is just a distant memory. But you're in shape and you go out running and you feel the wind on your body and you feel the capacity that you have to go faster, to go further if you want to. That is involving not only a feeling of capacity, but a feeling of unity. It's something that we can come to desire, to have this relation of desire to life itself. When we're engaging in other bodily activity, when we're say preparing food, or now sitting down and eating the food, when it's good food, it gives us a sense of wholeness. When we're engaged in sexual activity, not all of it turns out like that, right? But there's the possibility of that sense of feeling the unity of one's own living body, really being in one's body. So that's part of what he's talking about here. That's done at the expense of this category of life. So he says, just by so doing, it supersedes its antithesis to the other, by means of which it exists for itself. So it overcomes it. It engages in an Aufhebung, a incorporation of that antithesis. That doesn't mean that the antithesis goes away, but it's transformed in the process. Now Hegel says, sort of paraphrasing here, by the way, supersession doesn't just happen in terms of the individual at the expense of the universality. There's also a supersession going on of the individual that the individual may not be aware of. So he says, conversely, the supersession of individual existence is equally the production of it. Now, isn't that a fascinating thing to say? The supersession on the part of life as something other to the living thing, something greater than it, something enfolding it, something providing it with a world, we might say, possibility of relations, is at the same time a production of it. How so? Well, it's a production of that individual, which is existing at the expense of the universal, right? But it's also a production of all sorts of other individual shapes or living things. One is not the only living thing. I mean, that's almost an inconceivable thought. It's certainly a melancholy thought to think about being possibly the only living thing. That sort of solipsism may not, in fact, be possible. It could be the only conscious thing, or the only self-conscious thing, but the only living thing, probably not. So, he goes on and he says, here we go. Since the essence of the individual shape, universal life, right, and what exists for itself is itself simple substance. When this substance places the other within itself, it supersedes this, its simplicity. When life over here is being life, that is not just being sort of an abstract quality or category, that means it has to self-other, which means it has to turn itself into all these other lives, all these other living beings, these existing individual shapes that then take on a life of their own, you might say. So he says, it divides it. This dividedness of the differenceless fluid medium is what establishes individuality. That's why these are individual. Dividing into all these living things makes life be what it is. So he says the simple substance of life is the splitting up of itself into shapes and at the same time the dissolution of these differences. And the dissolution of the splitting up is just as much a splitting up and forming of members. So in these, it's not as if life just splits up into a whole bunch of shapes, sort of like cookie cutter, making a whole bunch of little living things. No, within each one of these, there's an entire cosmos of self, other, all these relations that we're seeing here. Every one of these things is also doing this. So he goes on and he says, now we see the two sides of the whole movement that were being distinguished actually collapse into each other. They are, in fact, this is where, think about what happened with the inverted world, right? Is the inverted world a separate world that's over there, bizarro land, opposed to the world that we live in? No, it collapses into the world in which we live in, because invertedness is a characteristic, this inward invertedness of the world in which we live in. Same thing with these two sides. They collapse into each other as well. So he says, the passive separateness of the shapes and the process of life collapse into each other. The latter, that is the process of life, is just as much an imparting of shape as the supersession of it. The other, the imparting of shape, is just as much a supersession as an articulation of shape. What does that mean? As shapes are being derived, they are being derived from life, right? Which doesn't actually exist on its own, we're finding out. That's an abstraction, but at the same time, it's what is binding all of this stuff together. So he goes on. The fluid element is only the abstraction of essence. It is actual only as shape, as the other lives, the other living things, or as the living thing that I know myself to be, or whatever is knows itself to be, through the very processes of, capitalizing on its relationship to life, big L, and consuming it, motivated by desire. So he says, this whole round of activity constitutes life. Not what was expressed at the outset, the immediate continuity and compactness of its essence, we were leaving that behind, nor the enduring form. That was important, but that's not what life itself is. The discrete moment existing for itself, nor the pure process of these. That's important, but that's not it either. Nor yet the simple taking together of these moments. Life rather consists, he says, in being this whole thing. This is all life. A self-developing whole, right? Which dissolves its development and in this movement simply preserves itself. So now we can think of life really in three different ways in this chapter, or in this, not chapter, in this paragraph. We have the individual living thing. We have the universal or the essence of life which is being drawn upon, which differentiates itself into individual things. And then we have all of this together as life as such, a whole.